Yeah. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. This is a distorted version of my book cover with the wonderful title, The Science of Weird Shit. Because essentially that's what anomalistic psychology is. It's basically starting from the position of, a skeptical position of saying, let's assume that paranormal forces don't exist. Can we explain the weird experiences that people definitely do without having to resort to paranormal type explanations? And I do talk about the kind of BEM episode in the book, along with lots and lots of other stuff. But anyway, that's just me trying to sell my books in my book. So, as I said, the title of this talk is How to Spot a Pseudoscientist. And it can be used in two ways. One, the obvious way that it might help you to recognize something that might be pseudoscience or pseudoscientific when you see it. Or secondly, if you have ambitions to yourselves to become pseudoscientists, then it'll give you some very good guidelines. There's a lot more money in pseudoscience than in science. So bear that in mind. In terms of what we're actually going to be talking about, basically, obviously, we're talking about pseudoscience. We must also talk about what is science, and that is referred to as the demarcation problem. So what is science? I'll say a little bit about a topic called proto-science, then attempt to define what we actually mean by pseudoscience, some of the problems that arise with these various sets of criteria that people have put forward. If I've got time, I might kind of finish on a controversial note. I'm one of the few skeptics who actually argues that parapsychology is not a pseudoscience. Most skeptics would argue that it is. I used to believe that, and then gradually I changed my mind the more I thought about it, but I might not have time for that to see. Okay, so in terms of the philosophy of science, the demarcation problem refers to that question: how can we distinguish between science and non-science? It's one of those questions that kind of maybe superficially sounds as if it ought to be easy to answer that. Turns out it isn't. So what actually is science? Well, various people have put forward different ideas. So Francis Bacon kind of took a kind of approach which said that science was based on induction. So you have a situation where, hypothetically, we've got our scientist, and she notices certain consistencies in the way the world works. So, for example, water always seems to boil at 100 degrees centigrade. And she then decides, okay, I'm going to test that. Formal hypothesis, water always boils at 100 degrees centigrade. And so she repeatedly boils water, and it always boils at 100 degrees centigrade. And eventually she gets to a point where she feels that she can announce a new universal law. Water always boils at 100 degrees centigrade. But there's a logical problem with that, as discussed by Sir Karl Popper, that just because you've seen water boil at 100 degrees centigrade 1,000,000 times doesn't mean that on the 1,000,001th or the 1,000,001st, whichever is the right way to say it, time, logically it's guaranteed that it will boil at 100 degrees centigrade. So there's a problem with viewing science as being based on induction. And what Popper did was to turn the issue on its head. He said, okay, you can never logically prove a universal law, no matter how many observations you make that are consistent with that hypothesis, but you only need one observation that contradicts it to say it's not a universal law. And so what Popper did was to propose that science is all about attempting to falsify theories. So Popper took this view of science as falsification. As we can see there, insofar as a scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable. And insofar as it is not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality. So basically what Popper was saying, as I said, induction can never prove a hypothesis or theory true. A single contradictory observation proves a hypothesis false, for example, the boiling point of water. If our hypothetical scientist happened to be at the top of Everest when she boils her water, she will see that it doesn't boil at 100 degrees centigrade. And that means you've got this, that means it cannot be universally true that water always boils at 100 degrees centigrade. And when you get these kind of contradictory data points, then you need to revise your theory and come up with a better theory that accounts for all the data you've got, including the superficially anomalous data, and also, ideally, makes interesting new hypotheses that you can try and test. But the basic idea is that you should always be trying to falsify your hypothesis or your theory. And if you can't, then you will provisionally accept them as possibly being true. But science is never about certainty. It's always about saying, on the basis of the evidence as it now stands, this would be our best bet about this particular issue. Now, again, I'm not going to go into great detail about the kind of characteristics that people have put forward to try to say, you must tick all of these boxes to be classified as a proper science. Because at the end of the day, I agree with Edge et al. That, it's just a quote from them, although there's no easy definition and although there are no hard and fast criteria by which we can easily judge whether a discipline is scientific, there do seem to be benchmarks of good science. So basically, I think along with lots of other people who've thought about this issue, they've certainly taken the view that there is no perfect set of criteria that would all agree, yes, this distinguishes all true sciences from all non-sciences. The kind of benchmarks they're talking about include things like replicability, having core knowledge and core procedures, the use of control conditions, connections with other branches of science, and so on. Now, before I go on to talk about the nature of pseudoscience, I just want to say a word or two about what's been referred to as proto-science. Stentz, 1972, defines prematurity in science as follows. A discovery is premature if its implications cannot be connected by a series of simple logical steps to canonical or generally accepted knowledge. Now, there are lots of examples in the history of science of situations where an idea has been put forward and has been rejected by the scientific community at the time, only to subsequently be accepted and recognized as true. Probably the classic example is this guy, German meteorologist Alfred Wegener, who proposed the idea of continental drift back in 1912 and was just not taken seriously at all, completely rejected. It just didn't fit with what the general kind of beliefs of the scientific community at that time. It wasn't until the 1960s that it was generally recognized that continental drift is a real thing. I mean, even a kid looking at a globe, you can see that it looks like those continents used to fit together. But no, that idea was rejected, as I say, until the 1960s, whereas now it's accepted by everybody. It explains earthquakes and all kinds of other aspects of geology. But a lot of other examples as well. I will say a little bit about Thomas Kuhn's view on these things. Thomas Kuhn, another famous philosopher of science. Kuhn talked about the importance of paradigms, or in his later writings referred to the same kind of idea as the disciplinary matrix. And this refers to more than just the kind of accepted theories and ideas within a particular discipline. It also refers to things like what were generally seen as being appropriate subjects to study and what were trustworthy methodologies and what weren't. The kind of set of shared assumptions within a particular discipline. And Kuhn makes a distinction between what he calls normal and revolutionary science. You seem to find in the history of science that within a discipline, there'll be long periods where everybody more or less accepts the general overarching theories within that area, and it's all about kind of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and just trying to tidy up the loose ends. We're on the way to truth now. But then you'll very often find that there'll be some anomalous data, some things that just cannot fit, just don't seem to fit within that theoretical framework. And you'll get a situation there where typically younger scientists within a discipline will start kind of making a fuss about this. And this is going to lead to what's called revolutionary science, where one overarching might actually be replaced by another. And according to Kuhn, it's basically most scientists, because we're only human, don't actually change their minds. They just die. And then the young revolutionary scientists who are on the way up, they become the new establishment. And of course, the prime example would be Einsteinian physics taking over from Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics explained 99.9% of all observations, but there were some that it didn't explain. Whereas when Einstein came forward with his ideas, they explained all the stuff that Newton could explain, plus some other stuff. And so that became the new kind of established idea. And certainly, I mean, if you think about different sciences, they didn't come into the world fully formed. Some people would say you can trace the roots of chemistry back to alchemy, the roots of physics back to Greek philosophers just thinking about the way that the universe is. And some, maybe more controversially, the roots of astronomy in astrology. But certainly, basically, we're going to have a situation where very often what we now take as being established, totally respectable sciences, it started from somewhere else and developed and then became what they are now. One of the interesting things is that within parapsychology, which I have a particular interest in, parapsychologists often claim that their science is an example of a premature science. In other words, they're ahead of the game. They are looking at things that the wider scientific community rejects, but ultimately the wider scientific community will catch up with them. That might happen. I think it's unlikely because typically scientific revolutions occur from within a discipline, not from people outside. I mean, when they designed the Large Hadron Collider, they didn't take possible paranormal effects into account. They didn't need to. Right. Okay, so let's get down to the heart of the matter. As I said, one of the things is it's slightly tricky trying to define pseudoscience when I know I haven't actually defined science. I realise that. I talked about falsification, which is what Popper put forward, but then I can really sidestep this. And I'm going to carry on doing that because basically, I'm going to cut to the chase. Pseudoscience, in a very general sense, can be defined as claims and methods that are falsely presented as science. But what is science? Well, you can take it that basically I'm going to be presenting you with various criteria that people have put forward to characterize pseudoscience. The opposite of each of these will be science, okay? So we'll do it that way. Now, one thing to take into account is that when it comes to defining pseudoscience, there's one or two views you can take on this. You can either say that if a particular discipline has even one of the characteristics of a pseudoscience, then it is a pseudoscience and that's it, it's banished to the scrap heap of ideas. Or you can take a more nuanced approach that says, well, there are lots of disciplines that might not meet all the criteria of science or might have some of the criteria of pseudoscience, but it is more of a continuum. Okay, so an example of the former would be there's a very influential, very slim little volume from 1982 on pseudoscience by husband and wife team, the Radners. They take a very hardline approach. They outline their 9 marks of pseudoscience, and they say if a discipline displayed even evidence of even 1 mark of pseudoscience, that was enough to condemn that discipline as being pseudoscientific. So they say it's very clear if it's got one of those marks, get rid of it, rubbish. Scott Lilienfeld, whom I tend to agree with, sadly no longer with us, but tend to agree with on pretty much everything, takes a more nuanced approach, and their quotation from them, science probably differs from pseudoscience in degree rather than in kind. Science and pseudoscience can be thought of as Rochian or open concepts which possess intrinsically fuzzy boundaries and an indefinitely extendable list of indicators. So basically, the argument is you take each discipline and you consider to what extent it meets these various criteria or fails to meet them, and then you kind of make an overall judgment. And there's no kind of clear-cut set defining line between saying, right, I've been on this side, that's science, I've been on this side, that's pseudoscience. I'm going to give you an example. I said the Radners outlined 9 marks of pseudoscience. I'm not going to go through them all, but just to kind of illustrate the kind of things they were talking about. Bear in mind, they were writing in the 1980s. I think that's quite important. But according to them, the marks of pseudoscience are found only in crackpot work and never in genuine scientific work. And one of their marks is anachronistic thinking, the tendency to return to outmoded theories that have already been shown to be unworkable. And a couple of examples there would be flat earthers, which, as you're probably aware, have been a resurgence lately, oddly. Creation science, the idea that, I mean, when I say creation science, that's probably I should say creation science. The idea that the Earth is much younger than scientists generally believe, and in fact it's only a few thousand years old. And they try to present arguments, and they would claim evidence to support that position. Looking for mysteries. The assumption that if conventional theorists can't supply completely watertight explanations for every single case, then they should admit that the pseudoscientific claim is valid. You find this particularly within, say, ufology, people who are studying UFOs and particularly arguing for the ET hypothesis, the idea that UFOs are something to do with aliens, blah, blah, blah. And also people who investigate ghosts, that kind of situation where if you can't put forward a completely definitive counter-explanation, you should accept it's paranormal or it's aliens or whatever it is. Well, is that reasonable? I say no. We don't expect the police to be able to solve every single crime they investigate, because sometimes the evidence that would provide the true explanation just isn't there anymore. It's gone. And so we have to just have a situation where we say sometimes we just don't know what the full explanation is. That doesn't automatically prove that a pseudoscientific explanation is the correct one. There's also a reluctance to allow critical skeptical analysis. I mean, a nice illustration of this was the Turin Shroud. For years, I mean, I'm assuming you all know what the Turin Shroud is, but in case anybody doesn't, the Turin Shroud is a shroud that was said to have wrapped the body of Christ after the crucifixion, and it said that this weird image of the face of Christ and the whole thing in kind of full length appeared by some supernatural means. Now, for years the Catholic Church refused to allow carbon dating, even a tiny shred of the Turin Shroud. When they eventually relented and it carbon dated, it was proved that the origins were, they came from the Middle Ages. It is a fake, which is what's getting time. Appeal to myths. Again, this is where the kind of the fact this was the 1980s comes into play. You all look far too young to remember that. But I remember, oh God, I was obsessed with this book. I loved that book. I was a total believer in those days. Eric von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods. This was the claim that the Earth had been visited in the past by advanced alien civilizations, and there was evidence around to prove that. I loved it. I now realise it's, use the technical expression, a total load of bollocks. But it was dead exciting at the time. But the tendency to assume that ancient myths are literally true. So a lot of the kind of writings in books like this would look at the Bible or other religious texts and assume that this is not any kind of metaphorical type explanations. This is a literal description of what happened. Tendency to assume that ancient myths are literally true and that they can be explained in terms of hypothesized special conditions that held true at the time but no longer do so. And then argue, circular reasoning, that the myth itself offers confirmation of the hypothesis. The grab bag approach to evidence, the attitude that sheer quantity of evidence makes up for any deficiency in the quality of individual pieces of evidence. Kind of prime examples here will be things like the Bermuda Triangle, where it's claimed that a particular area of the ocean where ships and planes mysteriously disappear. And when you go through and examine it case by case by case by case, there just isn't a mystery there at all. But that, you know, piling up all of these claims. I mean, again, it happens in ufology, it happens in various other areas as well. Now, irrefutable hypotheses, in other words, not being falsifiable. Falsifiability crops up again and again in these sets of criteria that people put forward. Popper himself argued that examples of areas where you had non-falsifiable hypotheses would include astrology, Marxism, and psychoanalysis. And who am I to argue? A little cheer go up there. And yeah, I mean, that is one of the kind of most generally agreed upon indications of a pseudoscience. And there are problems with the falsifiability thing, which I'll come on to. But, now, a prime example of a nice illustration of irrefutable hypotheses comes with this notion of young Earth creationism or creation science that I referred to earlier. The idea that the Earth is only a few thousand years old and not much older than that, as accepted by conventional science. And there are problems for creation science because obviously there is evidence that the Earth is much older than just a few thousand years. That includes things like geological and fossil evidence. The light from distant stars took far longer than 10,000 years to reach us, so how can the Earth only be 10,000 years old? Were there rings in the trees in the Garden of Eden? Because if there were, that implies growth from prior existence. Did Adam and Eve have belly buttons? Because that implies an umbilical cord. I mean, there's all these kind of issues. Now, how do the young Earth creationists get around this? Well, they argue that when God created the Earth, he created it with those signs of prior aging already in place. So he created it with the fossils already in the rocks, with the light already in transit from those distant stars, with the rings already in the trees and so on. Now that means, of course, that it's totally unfalsifiable. There's no evidence you could ever produce that could convince a creationist that their idea was wrong. Therefore, it's not, whatever else it is, it's not science. And there's the argument from the basis of spurious similarity. This is when pseudoscientists point to some accepted area of science and basically say, look, we're just doing the same thing as those people over there. And the two examples here, one is astrology again, which crops up a lot. And this guy here is Wilhelm Fliess, who was a good friend of Sigmund Freud, and he put forward biorhythm theory. And biorhythm theory isn't just the perfectly reasonable and well-proven idea that all of life, there are biological rhythms, things that go up and down in time. But he argued that from the moment you're born, there are these three rhythms that kick in. One for physical health, I think it's physical, emotional, I can't remember what they are now. Anyway, there's three of them. And they have this unvarying periodicity, like I think it's like 27 days, 29 days, and 31 days, something like that. And that goes on throughout your life. And back in the day, you probably still can, but certainly in the 80s, you could get hold of calculators. You put your birth date in, and it'd tell you where you were on each of these cycles. And if it was very low on all of them, well, just don't get out of bed, basically. You could have a dead. Of course, it's all total pseudoscientific nonsense. But they're both based on the idea of cycles, of rhythmicity, and of course, as I say, there are real good, strong empirical evidence for biological rhythms and so on. It doesn't prove that these ideas are correct. I think this is the last one of the Ravner's criteria that I'll mention, I think. The refusal to revise in the light of criticism. The tendency to argue that pseudoscientific beliefs are better than conventional scientific beliefs because conventional science is constantly rejecting, refining its theories. So you'll find astrologers who will say, they'll point out that Western astrology today is pretty much identical to what it was 2,000 years ago. And they say it's because it's true, it's eternally true. Whereas, the fact that, scientists used to say that Newton was right, and then, no, Newton's got it wrong, it's Einstein that's right now. We're always changing our minds as scientists, they see that as a weakness. And of course it's not, it's a strength. This revision of ideas, the willingness to kind of throw theories out that don't work and replace them with better theories is a strength, not a weakness. Okay, now I spent a fair bit of time there on, that's only 6 of the Radner's 9 marks of pseudoscience. I'm not going to go through all of them, and I'm also just going to present another couple of sets, because different people have put forward different sets of criteria. And again, I'm not going to discuss these in any kind of detail. I'm going to shoot through them, so I want to make a few general points. So this is in James Alcock's book, which is the book that turned me on to skepticism in the first place. He summarises Mario Bunge, I don't know how you pronounce that, Bunge, his criteria that he put forward. So, and this is his criteria for pseudoscience. It's a pseudoscience if its theory of knowledge is subjectivistic, containing aspects accessible only to the initiated. I mean, a good example there might be psychoanalysis. You cannot become a psychoanalyst until you've gone through psychoanalysis yourself. Its formal background is modest, with only rare involvement of mathematics or logic. Its fund of knowledge contains untestable or even false hypotheses, which are in conflict with a larger body of knowledge. Its methods are neither checkable by alternative methods, nor justifiable in terms of well-confirmed theories. It offers nothing, it borrows nothing from neighbouring fields. There is no overlap with another field of research. It has no specific background of relatively confirmed theories. It has an unchanging body of belief, whereas scientific inquiry teems with novelty. And it has a worldview admitting elusive, immaterial entities, such as disembodied minds, whereas science countenances only changing concrete things. So that's one set of criteria. Here's another set. I'm a big fan of Scott Lilienfeld, so I think this is quite a nice set. He says it's a pseudoscience, you can spot it if there's a tendency to invoke ad hoc hypotheses, which can be thought of as escape hatches or loopholes, as a means of immunizing claims from falsification. An absence of self-correction and an accompanying intellectual stagnation. An emphasis on confirmation rather than refutation. A tendency to place the burden of proof on skeptics, not proponents of claims. Excessive reliance on anecdotal and testimonial evidence to substantiate claims. Evasion of the scrutiny afforded by peer review. Absence of connectivity, that is a failure to build on existing scientific knowledge. Use of impressive sounding jargon whose primary purpose is to lend claims a facade of scientific respectability. And finally, an absence of boundary conditions. That is a failure to specify the settings under which claims do not hold. So the point there is I've now presented you with 3 sets of criteria. You can see that there are common themes there, but there's also quite a lot of variation. So as with science, there's not really that anybody's come up with a kind of set of criteria there which says, yeah, that's it, spot on, you got it there. As I mentioned in passing, I think some of those criteria were influenced by the particular cultural background at the time. Back in the 1980s, things like the ancient astronaut hypothesis, although it still gets some coverage on various really shocking TV programs, it was a really big thing back then. You know, that book, as I say, was a bestseller in Von Daniken, was hugely successful. There were also books like Worlds in Collision by Velikovsky. There was all that kind of idea was around, whereas now it all looks a bit dated because it's not a big thing anymore. Still around. And there are problems with, I mean, falsification appeared in all of those sets of criteria, and I think with good reason. But there are some problems with thinking that Popper's totally cracked it. Falsification, that's the answer. If a statement or a theory is not falsifiable, then it's not science, and that's it. You know, that's how you decide. There are some problems with that notion. At best, it is prescriptive, not descriptive. What I mean is, I don't know a single scientist, I mean, I suppose I think of John Eccles, that would be one, but I can't think of any others who go around trying to falsify their own hypotheses. We just don't do it. We run experiments, we've got a particular hypothesis in mind, we analyse our data, and we rejoice and jump up and down and dance around our offices when the results come out in line with our expectations, our hypothesis. And I can speak from personal experience on how difficult it is to actually get negative results published. Now, so we just don't do that. On an individual level, we do not do that. Now, you might argue, what you might say is that Popper is describing a kind of idealized view of science, and maybe he's describing kind of science as a collective enterprise, but he's certainly not describing it as it relates to individual scientists. And also, a second point, you can argue that a hypothesis shouldn't be abandoned following the first apparent falsification. There are good reasons to try and defend your hypothesis. Let's think about Uranus. Oh, I need to snigger. This is a really interesting kind of example of how you need to be a bit more nuanced thinking about these things. Back in the day, the orbit of Uranus didn't follow, it wasn't what Newton would predict. So does that mean, okay, we should reject Newton? Well, it seemed a bit rash, And so what people did was to try to see if they could come up with an explanation for these perturbations in the orbit of Uranus within a Newtonian framework. And one obvious candidate for that was maybe there was another planet somewhere out there that was causing those perturbations. And by thinking about it that way, that was what led to the discovery of Neptune. Now, we wouldn't say that that was an example of, pseudo-scientific thinking. We'd say that's a really good example of really good scientific thinking, and it led, as I say, to the discovery of Neptune. But then when we jump forward in time, the orbit of Mercury also didn't fit what Newton would have predicted. And again, scientists tried the same kind of thing. There were those who tried to say, well, maybe we've got the mass of Mercury wrong, maybe we've got this wrong, maybe we've got that wrong, maybe we're just this and we're just that, we can make it fit. But in this case, no, that didn't work. And it was only when Newtonian physics was actually rejected, you can explain the orbit of Mercury within an Einsteinian framework, but that did take an entire paradigm shift. Now, again, those scientists who were trying to account for Mercury's orbit within the old Newtonian framework were not bad scientists. They weren't doing pseudoscience. They weren't being bad scientists. They were doing something very sensible, because you've got this amazing theory that explains so much. You don't just drop it at the first sign of an apparent falsification. And whenever you do an experiment, this obviously includes within psychology as well, you've got your main hypothesis that you're trying to test, but you've also got loads of implicit hypotheses. So when you're doing something and you need to measure personality and some kind of measure of performance and so on. Are you doing all those things properly? Is the measure of personality that you're using an appropriate one? So on and so forth. So no, you don't immediately drop a theory just because of the first falsification. I mean, the other way around as well. You shouldn't just accept a hypothesis on the basis of a single study, ever, certainly not within psychology. So does that mean that falsification is useless as an indicator of whether something is pseudoscientific? Well, I'd say no, it's not. It's a useful indicator if, on the one hand, hypotheses are non-falsifiable in principle. So like the creation science example, just in principle, there's nothing that could prove that to a creation scientist that their ideas were wrong, therefore it's a pseudoscience. Or, secondly, if there's an over-reliance on ad hoc excuses to avoid falsification. So particularly when there's not much evidence in support of the hypothesis in the first place. And so this happens a lot in parapsychology. If you try and replicate some reported paranormal effect, some parapsychological effect, and you fail to do it, parapsychologists have a tendency to turn around and say, oh, well, yeah, but you didn't run your experiment exactly the same way that we ran ours. And that's why you didn't get the results we got, and so on. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that what do we mean by over-reliance? There's going to be subjectivity in that. If you're a skeptic, you're much more likely to accept a failed replication as an indication that the underlying paranormal hypothesis was just wrong. Whereas, obviously, if you're a believer in the paranormal, you might kind of say, well, no, that's not really fair. It's going to be subjective there. Some people argue there are other problems. I haven't got time for a bit of detail on this. Other problems with the concept of pseudoscience. Richard McNally, whom I have huge respect for and agree with virtually everything he says, don't agree with him on this one. He opened an article with a kind of, I thought was a memorable sentence. When it comes to kind of defining pseudoscience, pseudoscience is like pornography. We cannot define it, but we know it when we see it, you know. And then he goes on to actually say, he didn't really believe that. He went on to argue that we shouldn't really, he thought it was not useful to think about talking in terms of science versus pseudoscience, particularly within clinical psychology. And instead, he puts forward as when therapeutic entrepreneurs make claims on behalf of their interventions, we shouldn't waste our time trying to determine whether their interventions qualify as pseudoscientific. Rather, we should ask them, how do you know that your intervention works? What is your evidence? So he says, you know, basically, you waste your time thinking about the philosophy of science in these contexts. Does it work or doesn't it? Marcello Truzzi, a sociologist, also wasn't keen on the notion of pseudoscience. I mean, you know, it is true that nobody ever took being called a pseudoscientist as a compliment. It's not a compliment. Truzzi says, there are good reasons to purge the term pseudoscience from our disputes. It may simply prove more useful and less incendiary to speak of bad, poor, or even stupid theories without entanglement in the demarcation problem. And I was kind of some sympathy for that, but yet again, it's Lilienfeld et al., who I end up agreeing with. The fuzziness of such categories does not mean that distinctions between science and pseudoscience are fictional or entirely arbitrary. As psychophysicist S.S. Stevens observed, the fact that the precise boundary between day and night is indistinct does not imply that day and night cannot be meaningfully differentiated. And I'd go along with that. Basically, think of all these things in terms of continua, yeah? And you're going to be at a certain point on the continuum, and then you make judgment about whether or not you think that means it's a science or a pseudoscience. From this perspective, pseudosciences can be conceptualized as possessing a fallible, but nevertheless useful list of indicators or warning signs. The more such warning signs a discipline exhibits, the more it begins to cross the murky dividing line separating science from pseudoscience. Okay, looks like I have got time for the controversial ending, where I argue that parapsychology is, in fact, in my opinion, deserves to be called a science. For many years, when I first started teaching this stuff at Goldsmiths, I was arguing the opposite to my students. And then the more I kind of thought about it, the more I changed my mind, basically. And you're allowed to do that, by the way. You're allowed to do that in science. Okay, so what is parapsychology, first of all? Often defined as the scientific study of claims of extrasensory perception, or ESP. That can be subdivided into telepathy, direct mind-to-mind contact, clairvoyance, the alleged ability to pick up information from remote locations without using the known sensory channels, and precognition, the alleged ability to know about future events before they happen, you know, other than just by inference. Psychokinesis, the alleged ability to influence the outside world just by the power of the mind. Just out of interest, I mean, if you believe in psychokinesis, could you please raise my hand? That's the best joke in the entire And evidence relating to the possibility of life after death. I'm talking here about the kind of parapsychology as exemplified by research published in, say, the Journal of Parapsychology, which is probably the best journal of parapsychology, rather than kind of, you know, Mystic Meg or people appearing on TV or ghost hunting groups on really terrible TV channels. The Parapsychological Association actually became affiliated to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, amongst much controversy, back in 1969. So I'm talking about parapsychology at its best. There's lots of examples of it at its worst, and lots of paranormal investigators who haven't got a clue. I'm talking about people who do what appear to be well-controlled studies under lab conditions, etc., etc. Now, one of the reasons I changed my mind about whether or not parapsychology was a science rather than a pseudoscience was partly through meeting a lot of parapsychologists, people like the late Bob Morris, Caroline Watt, and various others, and realizing that they weren't idiots, and they were really intelligent people, and they totally understood about scientific methodology, about statistical analysis, and so on and so forth. But in many cases, they had a greater appreciation of these things than most psychologists. I remember Bob Morris memorably saying to me, you know, we're at the stage where we have to say to people, yes, we did remember to wash the test tubes before we started, because they know that whenever they produced what appeared to be a positive result, skeptics would be down on them like a ton of bricks, looking for any little flaw in methodology and so on and so forth. So I'd be super, super careful. Anyway, what Mousseau did, she compared the contents of some mainstream science journals, Molecular and Optical Physics and the British Journal of Psychology, with fringe journals such as the Journal of Parapsychology and the Journal of Scientific Exploration. And she basically did a content analysis comparing articles in those journals along a number of different criteria that are often put forward to indicate that something is a pseudoscience. James Alcock had argued that there were various problems related to falsifiability within parapsychology, experimentary effects. This refers to the fact that researchers who are skeptics don't get these paranormal effects when we run studies to try and test for telepathy or psychokinesis or whatever, whereas believer researchers are much more likely to get them. And that is seen within parapsychology by some people as being evidence of a paranormal effect in itself, that somehow the vibes from the experimenter can affect the results. I'd have a different take on that now, which we'll talk about the Q&A if we've got time. Or another example is what are called sheep-goat effects. If I was to do a telepathy experiment with all of you guys, and we analyse the results, and then we divide you into those who believe in the paranormal and those who don't, we might find that we get a significant effect when we just look at believers, but we either get no effect or even a negative effect, sign missing, because it's not in the trade, when we look at the skeptics. Again, there's a lot more to say about all that, but I haven't got time now. Alcock thought these were kind of problems. I'd say no, we can test for those things. We can design studies where we look at, and in fact this has been done, where a skeptical experimenter will carry out a study that's exactly the same as one being carried out by a believer experimenter. And do we actually find these effects coming up? So we can test it. Emphasis on confirmation rather than refutation. Rousseau reported that in her sample, almost half of the fringe articles report a negative outcome, disconfirmation. So they don't have this fear of negative findings that was very prevalent and less so now, following as a result of the replication crisis. But trying to get negative results published in mainstream psychology journals was virtually a waste of time. No matter how carefully an experiment had been done, no matter how big the study was or anything. By contrast, no report of a negative result has been found in my sample of mainstream journals. So is parapsychology doing better in that criteria? Formal background of modest, little mathematics or logic. She reported that all of the articles that aim to gather new empirical evidence, whether in fringe journals or in mainstream journals, use statistical analysis. So no difference there. Failure to propose new hypotheses and theories. She found that 17% of the fringe articles deal with theory and propose new hypotheses, whereas that wasn't the case for the mainstream journals. Over-reliance on testimonials and anecdotal evidence. As it says there probably is more reliance on anecdotal evidence within parapsychology than within most other sciences, but as she points out, 43% of the articles in the fringe journals deal with empirical matters, and almost a quarter report laboratory experiments. So, yeah. Absence of self-correction. She says 29% of the fringe journal articles discuss progress of research, problems encountered, epistemological issues. This kind of article is completely absent from the mainstream sample. So again, parapsychology doing better than the mainstream. Lack of overlap with other fields of research. She found that in fringe journals, 36% of citations were of articles in mainstream science journals, e.g. psychology, physics, neuroscience. In her sample of mainstream science journals, however, 90% of citations were to articles in the same field, and this rose to 99% in the case of physics. So they're not cross-referring to other sciences, parapsychology does. The use of impressive sounding jargon. Now, there's no doubt at all that a lot of proponents of pseudoscience do this. If you think of the complementary and alternative medicine, for example, they'll use phrases like vibrations and energy and fields and harmonization, which kind of sound sciencey but don't bear any correspondence to what a physicist would understand by those terms whatsoever. But this imprecise usage is, by and large, not a feature of articles published in peer-reviewed journals in the field. There are a couple of examples of arguably failed criteria. I say parapsychology doesn't have a specific background of relatively confirmed theories, and it does have a worldview admitting elusive immaterial entities such as disembodied bodies. You know, things like out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, the idea that the consciousness can leave the physical body would be something that is entertained within parapsychology, and so on. But overall, I'd say parapsychology doesn't do bad at all, and in some cases actually does better than conventional science. So on that basis, and the final point I would make is sometimes skeptics, such as myself, or the late great James Randi, or Richard Wiseman, or Susan Blackmore, will actually test paranormal claims. And I'd say when we're doing that, we're doing parapsychology. And I'd say when we're doing that, we're doing it scientifically. Therefore, you can't say that parapsychology is always a pseudoscience. At the end of the day, science isn't a set of established facts. It's a methodology. It's a way of approaching things. So I end up with in this weird position where I'm arguing that parapsychology, I think, should, at its best, and again, you know, there's a lot of areas within psychology that are definitely pseudoscience, but parapsychology, like psychology at its best, should be considered to be a true science, even though I don't believe in the paranormal. So you've got this weird situation where you can have a situation where even if paranormal forces don't exist, the attempt to study them and test those hypotheses can be done scientifically, and therefore it's a science. And on that bombshell, I shall take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that. Very good talk. So we'll take. So I apologize for this. I have to juggle between two audiences. Please. Okay. Yes, we have a sciencey audience online, and we have an in-person skin and bone audience here. So.
Hi, Chris French. So, in terms of parapsychology, do they believe that these sort of things are coming from a different dimension of the brain, or just the human being?
We talk about paranormal forces in general, kind of. I mean, different parapsychologists would have different views. This is one of the things about it, that there are problems in even kind of defining a lot of the terms within parapsychology. I mean, to some extent, it's almost kind of any anomalous results can be treated as being potentially paranormal, you know, which is a problem. Because ideally, you want some solid theory behind it that is driving the whole thing. Now, I mean, another issue that arises from what you're saying is that often parapsychology is kind of defined in negative terms. So it's defined in terms of phenomena which cannot be explained in terms of conventionally accepted scientific concepts. And that means that potentially, if it was successful, it could define itself out of existence. I mean, to give you a specific example, people, before they knew how bats could fly around without bumping into things, because they didn't know about sonar, it was hypothesized that maybe it was some kind of psychic ability. But once they'd figured out that, oh no, it's not, it's this thing called sonar, then it's not a paranormal phenomenon anymore. And I mean, if we got to a point where parapsychologists could prove that people were genuinely able, people were genuinely able to pick up on thoughts of others, telepathy and others, the next step would be, okay, we've now got to figure out how this is happening. What's going on in the brain that allows that to happen? What kind of fields might be involved, electromagnetic fields or whatever. But again, if we got to that point and we explained it all in terms of those conventional scientific concepts, it's not paranormal anymore. So, but they don't have a clear idea on that. There would be a very wide range of different opinions. Some people will, go for explanations in terms of spiritual realms. Others will say, no, it's something to do with the brain, you know, but we just don't know what it is yet. And there's a very wide range of opinions there.
They like, do they believe in, do they like accept spirits? Because that kind of.
Some do, some do, and some don't. Yeah, so you get, I mean, again, like I say, you get a very wide range of opinions amongst parapsychologists. Some of them are definitely driven by experiences that they themselves have had. Others believe in this stuff for different reasons. There's some that spend their entire careers trying to run experiments to get evidence to support, say, telepathy, existence of telepathy or something like that, and never have any success at all, but still continue to believe, you know. Some of them look back in history to the heyday of mediumship, where, you know, all sorts of weird stuff was supposed to happen in these seances. It was a very rare medium who wasn't caught cheating. You know, that's how they did most of it, if not all of it, in my opinion. But you know, but some of them will say, yeah, but there's some things that couldn't be explained, some things that did defy conventional scientific explanation. I'd say if you catch somebody cheating, it puts a big question mark over everything they do, not just that one specific thing. But I would say that I'm a skeptic. Do you want to do the pointing, or do you?
Oh, no, I'll get there. I do actually have a question. I'll use my chair's privilege, which I've been amusing this week. But I'm interested in sort of psychology behind what people believe, what they believe, and particularly in the context of this, of distinguishing good and bad science. You often come across people, and thinking back to Ising, that almost they become so entrenched in doubt that they begin to even question even sort of well-founded positions or theories or scientific evidence. I think the most recent example is sort of John Ioannidis and his sort of stuff in COVID. But before then, he was absolutely sound on, you know, false positives in psychology and the scientific literature. What are your thoughts on that? I know it's not really a fair question, but what are your thoughts on the kind of people who become so kind of wrapped up in doubt that they could actually become misguided through it?
I don't know. I mean, it's a really interesting. Saying the obvious, it's a really interesting phenomenon when it happens. I really don't know. Kind of, I haven't really got anything else useful to add. Actually, I don't know why that happens. I mean, it is very, very odd when it does happen. I mean, another more recent example from my world, David Marks, who is a big critic of Ising, amongst other things. But also, I write about this in my book, folks. It's in the epilogue. But in the epilogue, I actually kind of posed the question, kind of, what would it take to convince you? I used to be a believer in the paranormal for many, many years, right into adulthood. Then discovered the joys of skepticism. And I posed the question in the epilogue, what would it take to kind of pull me back onto the other side of belief? And I kind of, without going into the details, someone got in touch with me and described their own conversion from being a lifelong atheist and skeptic. And then her partner died, and she basically thought she was seeing lots of signs that he was trying to communicate from the afterlife. And she ended up as being a total believer, not only in the paranormal but also God. You know, and it was a really interesting account. She writes really well. She's a professional writer. So I just cut and pasted her email into the book. Yeah. But then I said, you know, some people might argue, well, she wasn't a proper skeptic to begin with. However, David Marks used to be, I used to use him as an example in my lectures as what I thought was an extreme skeptic. I'd have him at one end and a guy called Dean Radin at the other. And I would say, how can clearly intelligent people look at the same body of evidence and come to such diametrically opposed conclusions? And I'd say I was kind of somewhere in between, still on the skeptic side, but not as extreme as Marx. His most recent book, he seems to have really revised his position. Not on the basis of all the lab-based stuff, which he still thinks is just totally unconvincing. He's not moved by that at all, but on the basis of a personal experience that he had of a series of, he sees them as being really impressive coincidences that he thinks just couldn't possibly have arisen just by chance. And he's written on the psychology of coincidences, you know. And so now his position is that, he seriously entertains the idea that maybe paranormal things can happen, or psi, as we use the general term. Psi can occur spontaneously in everyday life, but it'll never be captured in the laboratory. And that is a really big turnaround. Now, there's no doubt at all that this guy is a proper skeptic. I mean, he founded New Zealand Skeptics, and he wrote one of the classics of the skeptical literature, The Psychology of the Psychic. Brilliant book. And yet he has gone from one to the other. I mean, in that case, I can say what the reason was. It was this profound experience that he had. But it still strikes me as being really odd that he thinks about it in the way he now does compared to how he would have once thought about it.
Okay, I think we have time for one quick question before we bring.
There were two answers there.
Who wants to fight?
But I have a follow-up on what you said.
Okay.
So almost the reverse. What about people who are quite dogmatic? Is it even possible to change their minds? And is there point in debating?
Are you talking about dogmatic skeptics or dogmatic believers?
Oh, dogmatic believers. So I am also talking about the sort of the sort of parapsychologists as well as people who just do pseudoscience.
Well, I mean, again, the dogmatic people on either end, you're probably not going to convince them. Nothing is going to convince them. I mean, I sometimes get a little bit annoyed when people say, oh, skeptics are also closed-minded. I can say what would convince me. You know, I mean, if there was a reliable, robust, replicable demonstration of telepathy that, you know, it doesn't have to be 100% replicable, we don't expect that, but, you know, something that overall was enough to convince the wider scientific community, fine, I might be wrong, maybe telepathy does exist. That would convince me. Whereas the people who make this criticism haven't put anywhere near the number of hours into testing paranormal hypotheses directly for themselves as I have, and yet they're accusing me of being closed-minded, you know. So that annoys me a bit. At the other end of the scale, I mean, guarantee we've done a lot. One part of what we do is test claimants who claim to have psychic powers. And we go to great trouble to design tests with them that they are happy are fair tests of their claims. We have to sign something in advance to say that. We then run the test, they fail the test, and then they decide it wasn't a fair test after all. You know, I mean, so we're bending over backwards to say, you know, you can really do this. It'd be an amazing scientific breakthrough. Let's go for it. Let's see if you can do it. But no. So the ones at either end, extreme, you're not going to convince. They'll have all kinds of rationalizations as to why they don't need to revise their opinions. But the ones in the middle, you know, they're also, like I say, I've moved from being a believer to a skeptic, in fact, towards the centre ground, and other people have. Susan Blackmore started off as a believer, you know, spent many years trying to prove the paranormal was real, and then became very, very skeptical, you know, so people can change their opinions.
Okay, we'll have one last question. I know I said that was the last one, but we'll have one virtual one because this is a former student of yours, Chris. So a
former student?
Yes, Merger is a lecturer at Kingston University. So his question is, there seems to be a rise of pseudo-intellectualism, brackets, influencers pretending to be experts, and anti-intellectualism, so dismissing experts. What can be done to protect against this without all of us having to stop our careers and become science communicators full time? Is it even our job to do this?
That's a very good question. I mean, I can only answer in the most general terms, I'm afraid. I mean, what we need is to teach critical thinking skills much earlier and much more effectively in schools, basically, so that people, but it's not a matter of trying to tell people what to think, it's about how to think, why you should place more weight on some forms of evidence than other forms of evidence. You know, the obvious examples being anecdotes are not a very good form of evidence, even personal experience, which most people take as being the strongest form of evidence. As psychologists, we just know it's not. You know, I can have a hallucination, any of us can. I can be convinced that what I've experienced is real, but it wasn't. You know, we all have false memories, etc., etc. But train people kind of how to differentiate between good quality evidence and poor quality evidence it's a big task, and you know, people are making moves in the right direction, but there's a long way to go. So that's all I can say on that one. Sorry, I can't say more for a student. Where's the camera? I'm waiting into space here.
Okay, well, everyone give a round of applause. We're going to tour through, speaking of sources of hallucinations, let's move on to Robin Murray. So I'll just quickly pull up yours. It's really.
Interesting. I've got to go.
Sharing of the. You prefer to walk around, if you want to stay at the left, yeah. So if you're anxious.